Hello, everyone. My name is Aristotle Papanikolaou. I am the co-founding director of the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, together with my colleague, George Dimakopoulos. We're here with friends and esteemed guests to talk about religion, Russia, and Ukraine, and even go beyond that to talk, obviously, about the current crisis that is occurring in Ukraine. Before we begin, I just invite you to visit our website at fordham.edu/orthodoxy, and also our YouTube channel. This is being recorded, and this will be posted at the Orthodox Christian Studies YouTube Center within a few days. And we also invite you to visit Public Orthodoxy. Everybody here has been a contributor to Public Orthodoxy, and we have been posting a few essays related to the crisis since it began. So without really further ado, so we can kind of begin our discussion and learn from and have a discussion and learn from our panelists here. In the chat, I'm going to resend the registration page to everyone here, which has their full biography. So I just sent that to all of you. And but I'm going to just say a couple of sentences about each person in the order that they will present. So most, I'm sure, are known to the people who are attending here, but Father Cyril Havarun, who was an archimandrite, is a professor in ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at the University College Stockholm. He's a graduate of the Theological Academy in Kiev and the National University in Athens. And he finished his PhD at Durham under Father Andrew Lau. I think also relevant to say is that he was a chairman of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the first deputy chairman of the Educational Committee of the Russian Orthodox Church. After Father Cyril, we will hear from Dr. Regina Elsner, who is a theologian and a researcher at the Center for East European and International Studies, or ZOIS. And at ZOIS, Regina is investigating the dynamics of Orthodox social ethics in Eastern Europe since the fall of the Soviet Union. After Regina, we'll have Sean Casey, who is the T.J. Dermot Dunphy Senior Fellow of Religion, Violence, and Peacebuilding at the Harvard Divinity School. He was U.S. Special Representative for Religion and Global Affairs and Director of the U.S. Department of State's Office of Religion and Global Affairs from 2013 to 2017. And he served as Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University from 2017 to 2021. And last, we'll have Dr. Brandon Gallagher, who's a senior lecturer of systematic and comparative theology at the University of Exeter. His current research is on the Russian theologian of the 20th century, Sergei Bulgakov, his ecclesiology and orthodoxy's encounter with Western modernity. All of them are accomplished authors, and you can see that in their extended biographies. But without further ado, Father Cyril, why don't you lead us off? And you were just in Ukraine. You were with your family. You were there when the war actually began, and when the invasion began. So please, if you can, give us your perspective, what's happening on the ground, how you see things.
Thank you, Peli, and thank you for inviting me, having me with you. I have to apologize probably first about my backdrop. I usually prepare my books for Zoom background, but now I have this Maison de Chocolat in France, and I had to leave my home indeed, just narrowly escaping essentially the beginning of the war. And since then, I've been like moving around as a nomad, living the life of a refugee, experiencing it. It's a special experience. Anyway, so I left my home just with this bag, and I'm traveling with this bag only, and I don't know when I will be back to my home to see my my mom and my family. They are stuck in Ukraine, but they're safe, thanks God. And I'm in a much better situation than most Ukrainians are. I communicate with my friends every day, with my relatives, some of them in a better situation because they managed to escape to the western part of Ukraine. Some didn't manage, and they are stuck really in their homes, being bombarded. They need to take shelter every second hour or so, and they live with the idea of that their life can end any moment, actually. Yes, this is a very Christian experience of memento mori, of course. I don't wish everyone to have this experience. And this is also a shocking experience in the terms that everything that we knew well, like places, homes, friends, they have changed completely. Now it's a completely different world. It's like essentially sleepwalking, and we want to to wake up, and we realize we cannot. It's an experience that I think no one experienced in their lives. Something that we need to accustom somehow and to reflect in order to reflect upon it properly. It will take time, and it's certainly a post-traumatic experience. And I'm afraid that well, half of the Ukrainian nation will suffer from this post-traumatic experience to which they are exposed because of this Russian aggression. So it's horrible. It's unbelievable. It's unimaginable. Something that we saw in the movies about the Second World War, or what we heard from stories told by our grandfathers and grandmothers, like my grandfather and his generation participated in World War II. It's something that we experience. I remember very well. Excuse me for this personal kind of excursus. I remember my grandfather telling me about the Great War II. That when I asked when I was a young boy that. The most important thing about the war is that you know that you will die, but there is a small chance that you will survive. That is the most important thing. And I think this is something that many people in Ukraine feel like there is a huge probability that either themselves or their relatives, people or friends may die because the bombardment is getting more indiscriminatory. It's more like, even though Russians say it's a smart bombardment, they target the military targets. It's not the case. Even the American equipments, they miss targets, not to say about the Russian equipments and weapons. They always miss the targets, and they increasingly they increase their violence against civilian population, the Russians, as soon as they get desperate about their goals. And what is clear nowadays in Ukraine is that Russia is not reaching its goal, which was set originally to capture Kyiv and to overthrow the government and to install a puppet government, something like the government in Belarus. There is a resistance in Ukraine. It's a guerrilla war. Now it's a guerrilla war in the towns, which is really a nightmare for any occupying power. My own take, kind of my own hermeneutics of the war, it is like the Maidan that we had in 2014, the revolution of dignity, what we call the revolution of dignity, when all people, regardless of their beliefs, political, persuasions, regardless of their walks of life, came together in solidarity. There is a huge momentum of solidarity among Ukrainians, just like what we had in the Maidan, for the same purpose, for the same goal, to repel the intruder, to save our democracy. We really, really value our political system. Well, of course, we criticize it when it is peace, but in the war, we really treasure it. We believe it is important for us, this Republican attitude, this democracy. And we realized that the monarchical model of manipulations and violations that Putin tries to impose upon us will not work. We are not going to tolerate, and we are ready to sacrifice our lives, for to preserve what we believe. Yeah, that is kind of the background, if you want, including the personal touch. And now I'd like to say a few words probably about the religious dimension of it. It is strong. In my publications, I mentioned many times that the Maidan was a religious phenomenon in 2014. It was underpinned by religious beliefs. It was expressed through religious language, like the language of icons, the language of the scriptures, the language of liturgy, if you want. Even though it was a political phenomenon per se. I mean, the Maidan, it was just a political manifestation. People came to the streets and to the central square of Kyiv, the Maidan, to reach, to protect their kind of political values, but they did it through religious means and means of expression. It's in this sense, I think this war has I call it the third Maidan. We had the first one in 2004, the Orange Revolution, now the second, the Revolution of Dignity 2014. And now we have this third Maidan, and it is also has a very strong religious dimension. It seems that this dimension of the war has been initiated and instigated, I would say, by the perpetrator. I carefully watched the address by Vladimir Putin just on the eve of the military intrusion, 21st of February, when he gave an extended, a long lecture on history. Essentially, it was a lecture on historiosophy, his take on history, a philosophy of history, which he built actually on some, takes from the Russian religious Renaissance, and Father Anastasius probably will tell us more about this. He certainly, Putin certainly read some thinkers, religious thinkers from Russia, and he builds his ideas, his own ideas on them, on some of them. It's very eclectic, it's very unprofessional, as we can see. And it's like a myth. He has created a myth. He's a myth's demiurge. And at the same time, he's a victim and adept of the myth that he has created, he has contributed to. And this myth is very religiously kind of charged, if you want. I believe that Putin, and I already articulated this in some pieces that I've written, I believe that Putin has a very strong metaphysical kind of outlook. Yes, on the one hand, he is staunchly pragmatic, and he's a politician, a political animal. Certainly, at the same time, he is a metaphysical personality, a persona, if you want. And I believe this metaphysics of his views, of his historiosophy, is bad, is evil, is unorthodox, if you want. He pretends to be orthodox, but he is profoundly unorthodox. I believe, let me express it in the terms of our tradition. I believe he is a heretic. And he's a heretic not just because he kills people, because he's a murderer, but he's a heretic also because he has profoundly unorthodox metaphysical tenets. I believe that Putin is Manichaean. His outlook at the history is dualistic. He sees the world in black and white, and he sees the world as being divided into a good thing and a bad thing. For him, Russia is such a good thing, a piece of of the goodness incarnated, and for him, the West is the incarnation of the evil, the essential, the evil per se. And this Manichaean outlook could be harmless if he was just another philosopher, but he's a political leader, and I believe this kind of worldview underpins his political decisions. That's why I think he is at this stage, he's unnegotiable. He is not a person with whom you can negotiate, because he believes that any negotiator coming from the West or representing the West is not reliable, is not trustable, is not to be negotiated with, because he represents this kind of massive evil, evil mass, excuse me. Yes, he's paranoid, and his paranoia is increasing, is getting worse and worse. And I think it interferes, his paranoia interferes with this dualistic worldview. I believe that his politics is not just political, it is metaphysical as well. And I also believe that religion in Russia has become not just metaphysical, but also political as well. So there's a mutual influence of politics and religion in Russia. And I believe that the Russian church has become Putinized and has adopted his worldview to a great extent, has complied with this worldview to a great extent. And the Russian church has provided language that Putin expresses his unorthodox beliefs. At this moment, I believe the most urgent task for us theologians, especially political theologians, is to deputinize the Orthodox theology in Russia. I believe I set it for myself as a kind of a very important task, the Deputinization of the Orthodox theology, which has penetrated not just the Russian creed. It has penetrated, the creeds in many other churches. There are so many people around the world, in the Orthodox world, who are sympathize with Putin because they dream their Byzantine dreams, because they want this revival of their completely imagined Byzantine Empire in the modern life. And this harms Orthodoxy, this harms the church, this harms the society, this harms the people. And we see how much harm those dangerous dreams can bring. Just it's enough to look on the social media, on the TV footage, the destruction that the Russian weapons bring to Ukraine. That would be my take on this.
Thank you, Father Cyril. Regina, we'll turn it to you. I just want to let you know, though, I'm going to turn off my camera because I'm getting a weak signal. I just want to make sure I don't get cut off, but I will be here. Rest assured, I will be here. And hopefully my signal will get a little bit stronger, but I want to make sure I don't get cut off. So Regina, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much also for having me, and I'm feeling a little bit humbled to speak after Father Kirill, because this is really a challenging situation. We have now in Germany coming the first refugees arriving, and we are trying to help as we can and trying to organize as much as we can. But it's of course always very hard to speak from afar. So here is all my solidarity and to Ukraine and to you personally, Father Cyril. So in fact, there have been already a lot of things been said and written during the last years and during the last days especially, and to get a full picture, such a format of course is too limited. So I want to focus on 2 points which seem to me important in our context today. The first point is we have talked a lot about the religious dimension of the ideology of Putin in the last weeks, and there are already amount of texts and analysis on this issue. And we as theologians, as scholars of religion in Eastern Europe, wrote and talked a lot about it, and also about the problematic and corrupt relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian political elite. And these talks also widely resulted, in my view, in a perception that Putin performs now a religious war. First, it was a cultural war, and now a full war with massive arms. And I see it in media, in social media, in the media, in big media, that this is called a religious war. And I would like to argue that this is not a religious war, and it is even not helpful and maybe even dangerous to name it that way. Of course, it is true that the ideology behind Putin's actions contains religious arguments and ideology, and we heard about it just from Father Cyril. And yes, the Russian Orthodox Church did a lot during the last 3 decades to feed this historical construction, to feed the perverted understanding of values behind that ideology. And this is, of course, a scandal for the Russian Orthodox Church, and it makes it completely impossible for the Church now to leave its own story, so to say, and to get the distance to Putin. But a religious war implies that the war is primarily caused or justified by differences in religion. And I, of course, acknowledge the alarming dimension of cultural war in this assessment, which affects and threats us in the West directly. We have this discourses now very much in the American context, on the Western European context. But in the current situation, and this is, for me, it's a really important point, it seems to me that we as foreign observers are obliged to focus on Ukraine. And we should by any means avoid to produce the picture that this conflict in Ukraine is a religious war. Because that picture, the picture of conflicting churches in Ukraine, in often aggressive forms and tones from both sides, isolated for now quite a long time believers of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church within their own society. They now have not only to fight and to flee the Russian army blessed by its own mother church, they also have to fight against the deep mistrust within their own society, and they have to prove that they are real Ukrainians while fighting against Russia. I know from a priest from this church who is in a town today, the 6th day under Russian fire, and he sees dead Russian soldiers in his town and is in fact not able to bury them, although they are from the same church as he is. There's absolutely no evidence now that actors from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church are taking sides with the Russian army. There are some which are ambivalent, but there is no support. And all churches work together in their humanitarian commitment now to the victims, to the refugees, to the lost and forgotten people, especially in those regions which are now occupied already for the second time in the Donbass. And I have to say, and you can see this easily if you look on the media from Ukraine, that all churches are now open as a shelter during bombing. All churches use their bells as emergency signals and so on. So this war does not know religious, confessional, or denominational lines or limits. In this war, and for Putin, religion is not more than an instrument to gain acceptance for this war in Russia itself and among the Christian right in the West, we have to admit. And again, I'm far from justifying the role of the Russian Orthodox Church played in nurturing all those narratives. But we as foreign observers should be very careful, in my view, to name that war in Ukraine a religious war, apart from repeating aspects of the propaganda before the war. This framing of religious war might also have serious impact on the reconciliation processes in Ukraine itself after the war. And may this end of the war, of course, come quickly. But yes, we have to be careful with this framing, in my view. The second point I want to make very quickly, I would like to say a few words about the Russian Orthodox Church. The role and the position of the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church during the last weeks was appalling, and it caused a major outcry in the Orthodox and ecumenical community worldwide. And I saw already the question in the chat. No, the word war is missing still in all statements by the Russian Orthodox Patriarch in Moscow. In his statements, there is no war. There is a Ukrainian situation, some events in Ukraine, but no war. And the words of Kirill witness to his complete ignorance, of course, of the situation of the current events where the threat for his so-called brothers and sisters in Ukraine, these are not, he calls it, dark and hostile external forces that threat them, but the threat is Russia. The threat is the Russian army and blessed by Orthodox priests. And with the words of Kirill, of course, and even more, I would say, with the lack of certain words, Kirill stabs a knife in the back of his flock in Ukraine. But he does this also, and this is important for me, in relationship to other Orthodox Christians in Russia and in Belarus. Because the silence of the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church on state-sponsored violence, this is not new. We have seen it a lot of times during the last years. We know it from Belarus. We know it from many protests and violations of human rights in Russia. We know it already from the Maidan in Ukraine in 2014. The Patriarch was always silent on the state-sponsored violence. And apparently these events, as well as the war now, they do not meet this us and them picture the Patriarch is trying to draw. The church is part of the protest, the church is part of dissent, and it is part of the repressed and attacked society. And we have seen some really impressive spiritual and theological witnesses within the Russian Orthodox Church during the last years, which we should not ignore, although they seem marginal. And we should not ignore, in my view, the level of repression against dissent within the Russian Orthodox Church, which makes it very hard, and it makes it really dangerous partly to speak out against the central line, which is determined by Kirill. So the church, in fact, is not silent on war and repression, and we should not equate the church with the Patriarch. So in fact, instead of spinning the words of Kirill, I would prefer to look jointly for ways how the theological community, we as theologians and as churches, may improve the dialogue with the Russian church, not with the hierarchs, but with those people who are open-minded, engaged, faithful, and should somehow think together how we can reach them, how we can get in dialogue with them, and not abandon them together with the Patriarch or the church leadership. So these are my 2 points for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we just published on Public Orthodoxy a very strong statement by Father John Chrysovies and really the failure of Orthodox leadership more broadly somehow to really come out against things like political violence. So Sean, we'll turn it over to you. Yeah, you've had experience, when you were with the State Department in Ukraine, you have experience there. So we'll hand it off to you. How do you see it?
Well, first of all, thank you, Telly, and thank you to George for this invitation to join this august panel. I think I'm the lone non-Orthodox person here, but nevertheless, in my extent, no, I'm saying a no from Brendan, so I apologize. I once called George a theologian on a panel, and I dealt with his umbrage at that title, and so I'm sorry, I apologize. But anyway, it is wonderful to be here under these lamentable and horrific circumstances. Let me just say, from a personal perspective, to Cyril, I was in Maidan Square a year and a half after the revolution, and on a nightly basis, there were hundreds of people there lighting votive candles and setting up remembrances and memorials, and the power and the agony and yet the courage of the Ukrainian citizens was still palpable and quite visible at that era. So to see the resilience of the Ukrainians in this particular invasion is not a surprise to me. I think it tracks with what I've experienced on the ground there. But let me make 4 quick points. Back in after the invasion, the seizing of Crimea and the seizing of lands in the Donbass, the United States government became obviously very, very concerned about what Putin's motivations were and what was he going to do. Was he going to continue to take ground? And as director of the new Office of Religion and Global Affairs in the State Department, I was the guy who was sent to sort of look around and meet with the various religious communities in Ukraine and ask questions. Now, I will say at that point, we had a wonderful ambassador, Jeffrey Pyatt, previously Ambassador John Teft. So America had had a string of several years there, very strong ambassadorial representation and people who knew the religious dynamics of the country really quite well. Then we had the interregnum of the Trump administration, and lamentably, we do not have an ambassador there now, which I think is one of the great failures of the Biden administration, that they don't have a senior career diplomat on the ground, and it's inexplicable. And I think it's imposing costs on the American response right now. But there, the great question was, would Putin invade around the questions of how autocephaly was going to be resolved? And at that point, obviously, it was in the air, but the decision had not been made by the ecumenical patriarch. And we were sort of among a few lone voices in the senior administration foreign policy apparatus to say it's possible that a grant of autocephaly might create some kind of military aggression on the part of Putin. But predicting his mind was excuse me, really impossible at that point. But the administration did tread quite carefully around those questions of autocephaly, not endorsing pro or against, because we did not believe the United States had a right or the competency to explicitly enter into what was an internal theological discussion in the Orthodox world. Now, the Trump administration took a different view of that, but that was certainly their right. But I think that was a great diplomatic mistake because they just fed the paranoid narrative that somehow the ecumenical patriarch was a puppet of the United States government and the full weight of the U.S. government was behind this decision, and we prodded him into doing that, which was absolutely false. So that's sort of what the Obama Kerry administration did. Now, in terms of what Biden has done today, I would say, despite his criticism in his foreign policy to this point, I think the president has built a global opposition to what Russia has done, and they've done it quite deftly. And they certainly done it without any talk of sending U.S. or NATO troops there at this point. I do think the issue over the weekend of freezing the assets of the central bank in Russia was a draconian move that is already having an impact in Moscow. My understanding is their stock market is closed today, and approximately $650 billion of assets that the Russian central bank holds are now gone. That money is in Western banks, and they're not going to have access to that. I think so. Putin has made a terrible miscalculation here. And it's just going to up the pressure on him to do something. And now whether that pressure drives him into more bloody responses or does it cause him to pull back remains to be seen. But I think the Biden administration has actually done a fairly credible job. Thirdly, I want to talk about the theological problem that both Father Kirill and Regina have mentioned, and to point out that this political theological question of what is the relationship of the church and churches to the states, the various forms of polities that they interact with, literally goes back to the founding of the Christian church. And it's been something that Christians have struggled with all across the planet, who find themselves in a variety, thousands of different configurations of political force within nation states and within countries. I would simply say, I agree with the analysis so far. I think it's on the one end, the temptation of autocrats and plutocrats, and frankly, a lot of church leaders, is to meld the two, to meld the state to one church. And history suggests that that's terrible, that that's a heresy. It leads to body counts that sometimes are innumerable. But we live in a global age now where literally almost every Christian community we can name is facing these sorts of challenges, that the various tentative relationships that have been negotiated across history and across the globe are under assault from the rise of global populism. Now, this gets navigated and the configurations rage differently. In the United States, for instance, here, you're hard pressed to point to any form of Christian community that is not under some kind of pressure from a political and theological populace to form this eternal covenant, as Karl Barth called it, between the state and between the church. And the conversation that we're having here theologically is one that's being played out in the United States in just about every imaginable form of Christian community. So I see this as the great theological question of our era. It's a global theological question, and it's going to get navigated differently. And within Orthodoxy, we see the full range of options, right? We see people who are attracted to the political power. They're attracted to forming some kind of permanent eternal covenant between the church and the political organization. And so the answer is going to be navigated differently by different polities. I think what's doubly fascinating is that Ukraine itself is a religiously plural country. And I owe this to my former colleague, Jose Casanova. It's as we traveled, and as I traveled before that, I visited dozens of different religious communities in Ukraine, and it's not just the Orthodox. Now, obviously, Orthodoxy is the majority religion, professed religion of the population, but you have a robust religious pluralism there. And whatever we come to theologically is, in particular Christian traditions, we've got to deal with the fact of pluralism on the ground religiously in these various states. And Ukraine offers a very interesting experiment where you can find a majority religion, and yet you found toleration and equality and respect across those lines in a very impressive way. And that was true in the Jewish community, and I think even the Muslim community felt that, particularly the Tatars I met with in Kyiv, who had fled the onslaught in Crimea. So we should, in our theologizing, we need to keep in mind the fact that the fact of pluralism is yet another overlay on this complex theological problem of how does the Christian church relate to the government. And finally, let me just put an issue that has been touched on quite powerfully by Father Kirill. We are looking at potentially a mind-blowing historical tragedy here. Already there are 500,000 refugees that have fled in the last 4 days into Poland. And I was hearing UN commentators this morning on BBC radio saying that there could be between 4 and 7 million refugees fleeing Ukraine. And now this is in a world with 26 million refugees and about 85,000 displaced people on the planet. You inject 7 million refugees heading east through Poland and west into Poland, southwest into Moldova. The epic scale of that crisis is like nothing that's been seen since World War II in Europe. And I don't believe we have the capacity, the infrastructure, and the funding to actually resettle that many refugees in that part of the world. As it stands in the United States today, and I'll just simply close with this, most of the refugees that have been resettled in the US in the last 30 years have actually been resettled by religious communities themselves, working with the United States government funding. At most we've ever admitted was 200,000 refugees, and now we're struggling even to get up to 10, 15, or 20,000 a year. The United States does not have a full, robust resettlement, a refugee resettlement apparatus. That crisis, if it explodes, is one that will be with us for generations. There will be camps in Europe filled full of Ukrainians who are essentially stuck in massive camps like we see in other places around the world. And the prospects of that are absolutely horrific. But that's also, I would add, a theological problem. So I'll stop there, Telly.
Okay, thank you, Sean. And Brandon, you have the last word, and then we'll kind of follow up with some questions and discussions here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for all, and for especially for Father Cyril's very moving words. So I want to just to fill in what he had said about the Russian world ideology. Within at least the English-speaking media, there hasn't actually been a great deal out there. So I want to say that both the Russian church and the state now have a common ideology called Ruski Mir, or the Russian world ideology. And this ideology is partially motivated, the invasion, by Putin of Ukraine. So this ideology is a form of ethno-national religious fundamentalism, which is an appeal to blood, soil, faith, nation, people, language, and a common czar and leader. Like so many ethno-nationalisms before it, it demonizes all those who oppose it. And in the Russian world ideology, in the Manichaean way that Father Cyril said, the West is the great enemy. The Russian world ideology, and I don't say this lightly, is the new Nazism, the new Nazi ideology for the 21st century. And here I would say, look at Paul Gavrilyuk's important essay on public orthodoxy. So Ruski Mir, or the Russian world ideology, was developed in the 1990s and then in earnest in the early 2000s. It was created by a mix of figures, including Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, and it is repeatedly referenced by Putin in his speeches. It argues that there is a transnational Russian sphere or Russian world that includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, but also ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking peoples in Western Europe, North and South America, and Japan. It holds that the Russian world has a common political center, which is Moscow, a common language, Russian, and so you'll often hear that Ukrainian is not a real language. This is purposeful. It also has a common spiritual center, Kiev, or the mother of all Rus, a common church with a common patriarch, the Moscow Patriarchate, who works, it is said, in symphony with the common czar, president, or great leader, Putin, with common moral values, art, vision, etc., etc. One even hears that there should be a proposed alternative Orthodox financial system to reflect the spiritual unity of Holy Rus. I'm not making this up. It is not surprising that Putin denies Ukraine exists or there is a distinct Ukrainian people. For in the Russian world ideology, only Russia, Holy Rus, can exist, and it is eternal, having existed for 1,000 years. These different peoples and peoples of the unified Russian world, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow says, belong to a single, he says, unique civilizational space within which values, knowledge, and experience have accumulated. The Russian world, it is alleged, stands against a corrupt West, which has capitulated to radical secularism, which is led by the Americans. This Russian world ideology lies behind the words of Putin in his speech last Monday. And I quote him, "I would like to emphasize," he says, again, that Ukraine is not just a neighboring country for us, it is an inalienable part of our own history, culture, and spiritual space. These are our comrades, those dearest to us, not only colleagues, friends, and people who have once served together, but also relatives, people bound by blood, by family ties. Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. Putin is, I would argue, essentially enforcing on Ukraine by sword its membership in this mystical Holy Rus, or Russian world. And this is not isolated in terms of statements from Putin. After he seized Crimea in 2014, in March to the Russian Duma, he again says this, and I quote him again, "To understand why such a choice was made, it is enough to know the history of Crimea, to know what Russia meant, it means for Crimea and for Crimea for Russia. In Crimea, literally everything is permeated with our common history and pride. Here is ancient Herzanez, where the holy Prince Vladimir was baptized. His spiritual feet, turning to orthodoxy, predetermined a common cultural value, civilizational basis that unites the people of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Now, this ideology has been repeatedly referenced and created by the Moscow Patriarchate's paramount leaders. So we see in 2009, quoted by Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, he says, the core of the Russian world today is Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. That is Holy Rus. Precisely this understanding of the Russian world underlies the name that we give our church. And then recently, just this last Sunday, he says, God forbid that the present political situation in fraternal Ukraine, so close to us, should be aimed at making the evil forces that have always strived against the unity of Rus and the Russian Church gain the upper hand. May the Lord, Patriarch Kirill says, preserve the Russian land. When I say Russian, he said yesterday, I use the ancient expression of a tale of bygone years. Wherefrom has the Russian land come? The land which now includes Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and other tribes and peoples. And then he goes on about dialogical attacks. In conclusion, in my opinion, the Russian world ideology is a new form of religious fundamentalism, which in practice has become a new form of 21st century fascism. This ideology is being taken up and popularized by fundamentalist ideologues in America, like Rod Dreher, who advocates a culture war in the West. There are multiple analogs with Nazism and Italian fascism, including the appeal to historical or greater Russia, Holy Rus, beyond the borders of the Russian Federation, and an appeal to blood, language, faith, and soil. Let me be very blunt once again. The Russian world ideology is the Nazi ideology for our times. It shamefully was created by Orthodox people. It is now up to Orthodox people to oppose it boldly and truthfully and defeat it, just as Karl Barth opposed in his 1934 Barmen Declaration the German Christian movement who backed Hitler. It is that serious. And to quote Father Kirill, we must de-Putinize Orthodoxy. Putin does not want to reestablish the Soviet Union. Putin wants to create a fictional Russian world. And then in conclusion, let me say, we need solidarity with our fellow brothers and sisters in Russia, and because they too, many of them oppose this ideology, and they are doing this at great cost. Thank you.
Thank you. And it is the Russian world idea. It's very interesting because, at least as I see it, I mean, it gained some strength in the early parts of this past decade, but then it seemed to kind of fall off a little bit, and then now it seems to have been resurrected again in this particular conflict, invoked both by the Patriarch and by Putin himself. So its reemergence, its reappearance in this particular conflict, I think, is something really interesting. Before I maybe give you each other a chance maybe to kind of speak to each other, let me just ask a question about, and I think Regina touched upon this a little bit, but I think this is an important question for viewers who are a little bit new to the scene. Sean spoke about religious pluralism within Ukraine, and Father Cyril can correct me on this in terms of the details, but there are basically three really strong churches, a kind of a fourth one that's still hanging on, but three very strong churches. One is the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, of course. There is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, which has most of the parishes of the Orthodox churches and is under the Moscow Patriarchate, and the metropolitan there is Onufri, right? And then there's the Autocephalous Orthodox Church, newly established, newly declared Metropolitan Epiphanios there. has what, 5 or 10% of the Orthodox parishes, right? So my question is really about, has more than that?
Yeah, more than that. Well, the estimation is about like 6 to 7,000 communities belong to the Orthodox Church. Around 11,000 or 12,000 communities belong to the Moscow Patriarchate, and maybe 10%, up to the 10% of the communities belong to the Greek Catholics.
Okay, so I stand corrected. Thank you for that. But my real question is really about the relationship of Metropolitan Onufri and his synod and Kirill. And what's happening there, because we're seeing on Twitter sphere, I'm seeing a lot of different kinds of interpretations of what's happening. I mean, Onufri came out with one of the strongest statements against the invasion and for sovereignty. I then learned that the website of that church was kind of backing away a little bit, but now I heard this morning that they've sort of reasserted themselves in terms of speaking about state sovereignty. There's all kinds of interpretations about what's happening in that particular relationship. Some are saying, in terms of Kirill's speeches, that he's speaking in code to try to end the war, right? I don't know. I mean, again, so perhaps, I don't know if, just on that question, maybe Father Stroh, you want to jump in first, and Regina, maybe you can add some comments.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Well, Patriarch Kirill is certainly a politically thinking personality. I would call him the father of the modern, official Russian political theology, if you want. He's really talented in this, and he was very creative. He has been very creative in producing a kind of political theology that went as far as to engulf the Kremlin. And the Kremlin began speaking actually the language of political theology articulated by Patriarch Kirill. In contrast to him, Metropolitan Onufri is an apolitical person completely. He's a sort of like in our own terms, he's a hesychast, a person who denies politics somehow. It does not help him, however, not to be involved in politics, because this denial of politics sometimes makes a person very much politically engaged. And I think his conscious abstaining from politics kind of incited him to make some very unwise political moves and decisions. So it's really rare that he speaks up about a political issue. Even the war, probably could not make him speaking about the war. Probably he was, certainly he signed the document, he agreed with the document, but I'm not sure that he initiated the document that condemned the war. And certainly he did not write the document. I know the person who wrote it, and it's certainly not Metropolitan Onufri. But the good thing that at least he accepted that such a document is needed. And today they had this session of the Holy Synod of the Ukrainian Church where they also condemned the war. And probably this condemnation came from the members of the Synod, not so much from Metropolitan Onufri. So they are very different personalities. And I would say, because I know him, both of them quite well, I would say they don't really stomach each other very much because of that. Metropolitan Onufri tried to comply, nevertheless, with the policies of the Moscow Patriarchate of Moscow, even after 2014. Actually, there were two statements by Metropolitan Onufri regarding the political situation in Ukraine. One was immediately after the annexation of Crimea in early spring 2014, when he condemned explicitly the act of aggression, at that stage of that scale, by Russia. And the second statement is the one regarding this war recently. As far as as I know, the statements that really kind of matter, for the Ukrainian society and the church. And in between, for like 8 years, he kept practically silent. While Patriarch Kirill was speaking constantly all the time during all these 8 years. And now Kirill keeps silent and Onufri decided to speak up. So this also demonstrates how different they are. And I think there is a tendency of a rift between the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine and the Moscow Patriarchate in Moscow. It seems that, and I receive already messages, from priests and from even from the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. They say we cannot belong anymore to the church which we tolerated for a long time, regardless of what happened in the past, regardless of this rhetoric of the Russian world. And you are right, Ellie, that at some point the Moscow Patriarchate decided not to use this rhetoric of the Russian world. They shelved it, and now this rhetoric resurrected in the speeches of Putin. But nevertheless, my point is that the priests tolerated for a long time, the seeming kind of ignorance or neglection of the Ukrainian developments, of the needs of the Ukrainian society by the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. Now they cannot tolerate it anymore, and it seems that even the bishops started realizing this. There can be, I cannot be sure, and I cannot guarantee that a rift will happen, but there is an interesting opportunity now for the Orthodoxy in Ukraine to have a second attempt for reunification. After 2018, when there was the first attempt, and I just want to remind that at that time there were hopes that the entire Ukrainian Orthodoxy would unite under the same Homophorion in the same church, recognized by the Ecumenical Patriarchate. It did not happen. The Orthodoxy is still divided, and now there is a chance that the unfinished business of 2018 may succeed eventually again. There is no guarantee. It's too early. We don't even know whether we will survive, as a nation. It's still unclear. There are hopes, especially like today or yesterday, emerging from the operation today or yesterday. But through this smoke, dense smoke of missile attacks, there is kind of a beam of light that suggests that there could be an excellent opportunity for the Ukrainian churches to come together again. And our task is now properly to facilitate this possibility.
Regina, did you want to maybe? You have to, yeah, I'm mute now.
In fact, I have nothing to add if you don't want to pose another question in this direction, because I think it's quite sufficient what Father Kirill said. Yeah.
Sean, do you want to? Mm-hmm.
So, Kirill, when I was there in Ukraine in 2015, I met with Filaret. I met with Onufri second. He was not available. He was actually in Moscow. And one of the things that we picked up was that we had seen social scientific surveys that showed that the average Ukrainian was not particularly, at that point, cognizant, is it the Moscow Patriarchate Church or the Kievan Patriarchate Church? They just were going to an Orthodox service. But with the invasion in the East, suddenly people's sons were dying in the East at the hands of Russian and Russian-backed separatists. Now, this makes a difference. If your son is a victim of that war, you don't want to hear the priest talking about the unpleasantness in the East. You want people to be praying for the souls of your dead children. And this created a pastoral problem for Moscow Patriarchate churches, because there were parishioners, if you will, saying, wait a minute, this is not just unpleasantness in the East, our sons are dying. And when I went back in 2018, you saw in churches photographs. I mean, there would be murals of the faces of the dead children of that parish and with their names and where they died in the East. So as one person put it to me, that the greatest driver of Ukrainian nationalism at that point was Putin himself, because of the invasion. So when I met with Onufri second in their headquarters, I had this remarkable exchange, because I think they expected me to come and hector him because I was the U.S. representative. And after our formal introductions, I spoke and I said, I understand you are facing a terrible pastoral moment in your parishes and as the leader of the Moscow Patriarchate churches. And the shock on their faces was unlike anything I saw in my entire diplomatic career, because so they saw that not just as a great battle about the Ruski Mir, it was much more a pastoral problem, that they were losing members because of the Russian invasion. And so I think that's parallel to what you're saying now, that people are seeing the fact that the appeal of the sort of fever dream fictional dystopian view of Putin doesn't have as much weight as the body count does, that the citizens of Ukraine are seeing their country invaded and their citizens and army folk dying yet again. And so I think that creates a pastoral and theological opportunity here for a renewed conversation. And that will certainly be interesting to watch. But you saw the seeds of it, I think, back in 2015. I certainly did in my sojourn there.
Brother Cyril, any comments?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I completely confirm what Sean has said. And I also believe that the major driver of the ecclesial events in Ukraine, including Autocephaly and Thomas by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, was not political but pastoral. It was a myth that it was a political motivation for Patriarch Bartholomew. Exactly, well, Moscow projected its own perception of the church-state relations upon the Ecumenical Patriarchate, their own experience, and they believed that, yes, Bartholomew is just a puppet of the State Department, which is completely nonsense. I had a chance of several conversations with Patriarch Bartholomew, and I concluded from those discussions that his main concern was pastoral. And indeed, the situation was very simple in Ukraine. There was only one canonical church, and we believe in canons. Like, well, you can say that it's an Orthodox thing. Yes, it is. We believe in canons. And many people in Ukraine have almost like a mythical perception of the canons. They say the church should be canonical in order to be saving, right? So it's another word for legitimacy. Legitimacy means canonicity in our world. And there was only one canonical church at that time in Ukraine when the war started in the east, and people and those young boys began dying, and many of them came from the Western Ukraine, which is very religious region of Ukraine, and people could not tolerate the Moscow Patriarchate. Sometimes the priests of the Moscow Patriarchate openly refused to give memorial service to those priests publicly, which was crazy. And people had very limited choices, like either to stay in the canonical church, which appeases, supports, even if implicitly, the aggression against our own people, or to go to the schismatics, right, of the Kievan Patriarchate, or to leave the church altogether. And no, there were many people who chose the third path of leaving the church altogether. So it was a tremendous, I think it was indeed more a pastoral issue than anything else. Ecclesiological, political, you name it. It was a pastoral issue. And I believe that issue was successfully solved by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, because now people have choices still, right? They may stay in the Moscow Patriarchate if they want, but they may also belong to the global orthodoxy through the Autocephalous Church. And they don't have this idea that, oh, I belong to this schismatic group, maybe I will, perish in the hell, I will not be saved. Or people don't feel themselves anymore Christians of the second sort, second-class Christians, when they go to Mount Athos or in other churches, and they are denied communion, they denied conversation just because they are schismatics. It's not anymore like that. And I think this is a great achievement, I would say self-sacrificial achievement of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to solve this pastoral issue.
I will simply say very quickly, I had two conversations with the Ecumenical Patriarch. One was at the close of the Pan-Orthodox Synod in Crete, and the other was after the failed coup in Turkey, where I got to go because the U.S. government was sending a number of Washington-based diplomats to try to preserve relationships in the face of Erdogan's arrest and imprisonment of lots of people. And I asked him both times. I said, "How are you going to sort this question of granting, whether or not to grant the Thomas for autocephaly?" And both times he said, "It is a pastoral question. I will move in what I think is the best interest of the unity of the church." And my interlocutors back in the United States were saying, you know, what are the politics of this? What's in his head politically? And it wasn't. It was not driven, at least in his presentation to me. He truly wanted to be a force for preserving and growing the unity of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, and that was sort of the sole criterion that he was operating by.
Brandon, I invite the panelists too to scroll through the questions. We have about 30 comments and questions, which I apologize, we won't get to all of them. We'll probably go a little bit over noontime, but Brandon, do you want to weigh in on
I
this?
just wanted to underwrite that I was at Crete assisting in the press office of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and there was a lot of discussion of this at the time and things in the air. But what I gathered is that at that point the Ecumenical Patriarch essentially he had for years been approached in regard to this thing, and he was very, very reluctant to get involved. But essentially he was pressed into a corner. He could no longer ignore what he regarded as the spiritual weight of responsibility for being able to respond to a real pastoral problem. And it isn't an accident that it happened after essentially the failed attempt to try to bring Russia on board for the council. This, I think, could not but have been viewed in a very, very poor light, that all attempts essentially to essentially build bridges with them had failed. And so the motivation is not, as is claimed, that he is somehow in cahoots with the Americans. This is a part of this demonization, this Manichaean vision. It is a type of pastoral solicitude, a feeling that there is a responsibility for unity. And anyways, that's my take on that.
I just want to kind of clarify too, or throw in here, that what we're seeing in sort of the Russian-Ukraine situation is, well, there's three things I want to kind of maybe add. One is this very clear role of religion within the geopolitical scene. So that's, and we're starting to see that in the United States as well, as Sean sort of indicated. So I think maybe what's unique in the Russian-Ukraine situation is that the use of religion to actually justify, in part, to justify an actual invasion, right, related to the Ruski Mir. However, on the sort of Twitter sphere, we also see this language that related to some of the traditional values language and the ways that religion is used in other ways, that this is also justified, not simply because of Ruski Mir, but so that Ukraine could not, we can stop Ukraine from being this liberal, moralist, immoral, LGBTQ loving nation if it goes to Europe. So there seems to be kind of an interesting uniqueness to the situation. Like, I mean, is there anywhere else in the world where religion is being used in such a way as to lay claim on another nation, right? I guess that's one question. But also a comment really just to see the parallels in some sense, that this language of traditional values and cultural wars is sort of affecting how people from the outside view it as well, in the sense that we all know here in the United States, you know, you have certain Americans shouting Putin, 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 because they ultimately see Russia saving, and of course the great work of Sarah Riccardi-Schwartz in terms of alt-right Orthodox. I mean, Putin and Russia saving somehow Ukraine from this. So I just want to, the two roles in many ways seem to be converging here. And there's especially a kind of unique role in terms of justifying a particular invasion in a country. I just throw that out as for comment. I don't know if anybody wants to add to that. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, Father Sean.
I just may. Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very important aspect of the entire story that you've just indicated. And indeed, I usually explain the culture war is that it's not about culture and it's not really a war. And in the Ukrainian situation, culture wars instigate the war wars. That is the case in Ukraine, or at least justifies the war. And indeed, the justification for the ongoing aggression of Russia against Ukraine has been exactly this ideology of the Russian world, which features strongly this aspect of culture war, this conservative ideological kind of underpinning. And the thing is that, yes, a lot of people seem to be mesmerized, seem to be, really astonished by how Putin seemingly protects the traditional values. But the point is, it's just like with many other sympathizers with Putin, those who are Putin first ahead, right? Those who try to understand Putin. Essentially, Putin doesn't believe what he professes, what he tries to sell. And the paradox of Putin is that he actually sells different things, different goods, even incompatible goods to different audiences. Like he can be an ultra Marxist to the crooks in Venezuela or, in, I don't know, elsewhere in the world or in Africa, right? He sells successfully a leftist and a radical leftist ideology. At the same time, he sells very successfully this conservative ideology to, excuse me for my language, useful idiots among, the conservative ideologists in the United States, and they buy into it. In the same way, Putin sells orthodoxy to the Orthodox. That's why he has so many sympathizers among, the Athonite monks or, the Greek hierarchs or whatever, you name it. And he never is sincere. That is the point. He plays with people. He sells. Essentially, he's a seller of himself, of his own influence through those vehicles, including orthodoxy, including traditional values, including you name it, whatever. So that is kind of the diabolic nature of this kind of influence. It's not sincere.
Yeah, Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, just to back up what Father Cyril and you were saying, there's been 3 posts from Rod Dreher, or at least 3, and he has one called The Long War, and I'm quoting him now. He says, Putin is an authoritarian who uses Western decadence in the same way the Soviet regime did to justify its own repression. Nevertheless, that decadence really is there. Wokeness, if it comes from Hungary, is going to tear this society apart, as it is doing in America. So what you have are a lot of people who are seeing, they won't necessarily all agree that one needs to invade a country, but they're seeing that he is right, that the West is corrupt. So there is, particularly in Orthodox circles, but you don't have to be Orthodox to hold this, there is a type of transnational fundamentalism, which is shared by many fellow travelers. And a person who couldn't be here today because she was traveling, Christina Stuckel, has really in a magisterial way revealed these post-secular conflicts.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, I think this is where irony goes to die. I think in Dreher's case, I mean, putting up Putin and Trump as the anti-decadent police on the global scene just beggars the imagination. I mean, that falls apart almost as soon as the ink is dry on his writings. And so I think another part of Christina's work that is incredibly important is, where is the money going? Where does the money flow? And I think it's indisputable now that Putin's money is flowing all across the planet and through the Russian Orthodox Church. So the purity of the argument about Western decadence, it falls apart, I think very fast. I want to take up a question that Jose Casanova has posed, which is one that I think I have tracked. Let me just read Jose's quick question, and I'll give a quick answer. Jose says, we know that if the Russian invasion and occupation succeeds, leaders and clerics of the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine and the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church will be the first victims of the hit list, as happened after annexation of Crimea and Donetsk. I will say this is where global Majinsky acts come into play. In other words, if the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian army are in fact guilty of attacking church leaders who are opposing the invasion, there's another round of very pernicious sanctions that can be placed. I think that will be a trigger if we see massive human rights violations based on perceived heretical or anti-orthodox, little o, religious leaders in Ukraine. I think that will bring another series of engagements on the part of the West. There are religious freedom sanctions that can be put into place. I think that's a line that if they cross countrywide in a full-blown occupation, that's going to be something that generates really severe responses. And in fact, I think will increase calls for some kind of military intervention. Now, I'm not saying the United States is going to intervene militarily if that kind of semi-genocide or genocide takes place. I mean, if they start hunting down Orthodox priests from the Kievan Patriarchate or the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and systematically attacking them and seizing Orthodox property, then the level of international attention, I think, ratchets up a notch, and I think some of the consequences could be quite severe for Russia.
Go ahead, Regina.
I would like to bring it a little bit also back to the theological level, because the one point is that this ideology of the Russian world, Ruski Mir, or all those traditional values discourse, this is not exclusive Orthodox. This is a thing that is not only transnational, but it is. And I would even I try to think about this a little bit more in the next time. I think there's almost no religion in it left. It is an historical and value debate. But I think it is a challenge for us as theologians, as we are sitting here, and most of maybe of our audience also, is to put something against it, or to work constructively with it. And as I see it by now, we have also for Ukraine, for the case of Ukraine, we have still no socio-ethical discourse. We have a moral discourse, and we have, of course, some historical references and ideas. But Father Kirill.
Yeah, he kind of dropped off.
He's back. But what do we have to offer also for the Ukrainian discourse at the moment, who tried to figure out before the war, tried to figure out where to stand in this values discourse, and try to find theological ground for coping with the problems we have in modern society. And we have a very prevalent discourse of this traditional values, but where are the other voices working with the potential of orthodoxy, of Catholic theology, and so on, to work in another way with this, and to offer a dialogue which may proceed in this direction, and also offer to the Christians in Ukraine, to the Orthodox, who now try to come apart from the Russian point of view. But what are the alternatives, in fact?
I hear you, and given the way that the statements coming out from the various hierarchs, and my colleague George Nirakopoulos has a nice article in Commonweal about this, and some more have come out recently. The fact that they all use different language and a unified vision, I think, of a social ethics, a kind of a social, I think that's going to be on the ground rather than, it's going to come from on the ground, I think. And maybe this will spark even more reflection on that in terms of an on the ground effort to articulate something like that, which at least people on the ground maybe can rally around. But I don't know. I don't know. But Brandon, yeah, did you have a?
Yes, I just wanted to bring up a point John Burgess, who's a great scholar, had mentioned in the chat, but it takes up something that Regina said. I've been quite critical, I think it should be said, of the ideology that is held by many of the paramount leaders in church and state. But it must be said, there is great holiness in the Moscow Patriarchate, and there are people on the ground who are opposing this. Often, on the parish level, this is highly coded because their parishes are divided. So you will see them opposing it by talking in various ways, sometimes pietistically about peace, but in a necessary way. And I've seen homilies that do this very powerfully from yesterday. But it must be said that if there is going to be any transformation, anything that will, as it were, de-Putinize, as Father Cyril has said, it will begin in the Eucharistic communities. Many of the people there who are absolutely appalled that their brothers and their sisters are being killed for what I still hold is a new type of Nazism. And I don't say that lightly, but there, just as there was in Germany back in the day, there were many, many people who opposed this type of ideology, and many cynical people, as Father Cyril has pointed, who just simply use this because it is useful.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time. There are 34 questions and comments in the chat. We're definitely not going to get to, we're probably not to get to any of them at this point, because I think we at the Orthodox Christian Studies Center like to keep these webinars a little bit more compact, especially in terms of people who view them afterwards on YouTube. But I wanted to invite any of you, perhaps you noticed, like some of you have been doing, you've noticed a comment or a question. We've actually addressed some of them, but you've noticed a comment or a question in the chat. If you want to address that, or perhaps have like a final word. Virginia, we'll begin with you.
No, I in fact want to react to one question, and I think it's quite important to mention this also here, and maybe people will listen to it afterwards, that there is a petition from Orthodox faithful to Patriarch Kirill to act, to get out, to speak out, and to act against this violent regime. And I think this is important. It has by now only 300 or something like signatures, and it is not only important to reach or not to reach. I think there are little chances to get to Patriarch Kirill with this, but to show the world that there is more than just Patriarch Kirill speaking on this. And this is an important platform to do this. So I really would like to empower or to encourage people to speak up about this, and to notice all those grassroots movement which exist, because this is the empowerment they need from us, from the other side of this of this conflicted, contested region and church, in fact. So this maybe as my final word. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I mean, I think if Kirill were to speak out too, I mean, one of the issues is really a sense of independence of the church in relationship to the state. And, people like to speak badly about Byzantine Symphonia. I've been one who's been critical of it, but one thing for sure in Symphonia is that there was a palpable sense of independence of the church in relationship to the state. But what we're seeing in the Orthodox world, for a variety of reasons, is at least in some of the countries, is that the church is somewhat sacrificing its independence for state support. And so I think the church in Russia backed itself into a corner, and now it's somewhat paying the price. Anybody, Sean, do you have a sort of final word here? Or?
Sure. I mean, one of the questioners raised this notion of the rhetoric of traditional values, and again, Christina Steckel is sort of the one who's shown that appears in Russian Orthodox rhetoric at a very clear historic point of intersection with American conservative white evangelicals. And so that was sort of the ideological bridge where now Russian engagement with the American evangelicals in Europe, but also in the United States, is using traditional values as the trope to separate Orthodox. And the questioner says it seems to be between pro-Russian American Orthodox and those who are more loyal to the ecumenical patriarch. So it's really that it's a theological bridge, if you will, if you can call that theological. It's become a very powerful weapon in the American context. I would just simply say, I want to just simply reinforce what Regina said. I think the challenge here is on this big these theological issues about the relationship of church to whatever kind of political state context it finds itself working in. Every American tradition, I mean, every Christian tradition is wrestling to some degree with this now in the face of rising global populism. But then Brandon also raises is the pastoral issue. There's polling in America, for instance, that shows that American evangelical pastors are very leery of the kind of nationalism, white Christian nationalism that's coming up in their churches, but only a fraction of them feel like they're equipped to address it for a number of reasons. They fear of getting fired, fear of losing members. That's also, there's a practical theological piece here too, is how do we equip clergy in the local church to raise and discuss these issues, because the parishes are all divided. We've got people leaning left politically, people leaning right, but they don't have the theological tools to work through these tough issues at the local level, and clergy are intimidated in many cases.
And I put a link to Christina Stockel's post-secular conflicts project, where there's actually quite a bit of open access material too. We'll go Brandon, and then Father Cyril will give you the last word.
Yes, I just want to thank everyone for being on this panel. I guess what does strike me in looking at a lot of the rather too much media since this has happened is what I would call a type of maybe it's post-secular or secular blindness. So a lot of the coverage, which I've seen in at least the English media and reading across in both North America and in the UK, has tended to see everything in light of sort of geopolitical things in light of the Soviet Union, and has, as it were, been blind to the fact that there are religious and cultural things, which motivations in this, that it's woven into a story which includes things to do with the Soviet Union as well, but you cannot separate them. So I would say that what we need to learn is that outside of heavily, in the normal sense, secularized countries like Canada or say the UK and America, people still are motivated by these things, or even if they're using them, as it were, as a point of reference and a thing to do, it really, you cannot understand this reality unless you look at the cultural and the religious history. And that will continue to be the case. And I would hope that Western media would be less blind, because if they are less blind, they will be able to respond creatively and meet people where they are and talk through these things.
Father Cyril, sorry, I was on mute.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think at this moment, the most important thing is really to pray and to hope that the war will be over. It will not have as disastrous consequences and as Putin promises. And then, as a next step, we need to really go deep into analysis of why this war has happened, what led to this war. And I believe it will remain unexplainable if we don't take into consideration this religious dimension, ideology which is mixed with religion. We really need to concentrate on this, because it's not just an academic interest. Yes, we can, as academics, we can say, well, this is one idea, this is another idea. Both of them are they are different, yes, but we can operate with them. Some ideas kill. That is a point, and that's the kind of the very grave conclusion that we may make from this war. Some ideas kill, and we really need to understand them in order to prevent them from operating in people's minds.
Thank you, Father Cyril. And in the chat, we've put on several links. The two of the most recent ones is the petition that Regina mentioned. There is a book, Orthodox Christian Perspectives on War, which has many contributors to it, done, and which is very well done and has a lot of different perspectives, but also could be very relevant here. And so we invite everybody to look at those materials and Valerie Karras and Deacon Perry Hamalis are co-editors of that volume. We could go on and on, as is indicated by the 40 comments and questions that we have in the, but this is really just the beginning. We needed to talk about it. We needed to educate, especially get people to keep people to have, we need to keep talking about it as well. And hopefully we can, through these conversations, cut through a little bit of the ecclesiastical bureaucracy and get people motivated ultimately to shape the response of their leaders, really. The response of their leaders, because that's really what we need, leadership at this time. And hopefully the leaders will listen and see it and respond accordingly, especially those who are within Ukraine and within Russia. So thank you for a great conversation. Maybe we'll bring you back as well, because hopefully we won't have to, because hopefully the conflict will end. But again, thank you very much to all of you, friends of our center. Again, to everyone, Orthodox Christian Studies Center, fordham.edu/orthodoxy, public orthodoxy, just Google it. And this will be on our YouTube channel as well. And again, we appreciate it. We're sorry we couldn't get to all the questions and the comments. But again, thank you again, and let us all pray. Let us all pray that peace comes soon to that region. So, bye, everybody.